We're told history is shaped by grand ideas and battles for freedom. But what if it's far pettier? What if history is just a family dinner argument, but with armies? This isn't the story of heroes. It's the story of bad bosses and sore losers who happen to be kings. Get ready for 44 times the most absurd personal grudges imaginable led to absolute, world-changing chaos. 1. The War of the Oaken Bucket. So you think you've had a bad neighbor dispute? In 1325 Italy, the city-state of Modena decided to pull the ultimate prank on their rivals in Bologna. A squad of their best soldiers snuck into town and stole a wooden bucket. Not the crown jewels, not a secret treaty. A leaky, splintery, run-of-the-mill bucket from a well. Bologna completely lost its mind and demanded its immediate return. Modena, holding the bucket aloft like a championship trophy, basically told them to cry about it. And so, a war started. A literal, honest-to-goodness war, all because one city had the sense of humor of a wet blanket and the other refused to return a piece of glorified plumbing. That bucket is still in a museum in Modena, silently judging all of us. 2. The Pastry War of 1838. Just when you thought it couldn't get dumber than a bucket, France would like you to hold its beer. A French pastry chef in Mexico whined to his king that some Mexican officers had eaten his cakes and forgot to pay. Now, a normal person would write a bad review. The King of France, however, saw this as an international crisis of epic proportions. He used the crime of the unpaid croissants as his official excuse to send an entire naval fleet to Mexico. I want you to picture admirals and generals in a war room, pointing at maps and planning naval bombardments, all because some dude skipped out on his dessert tab. This has to be the most expensive and over-the-top collection effort for a bakery bill in all of human history. 3. The feud over Prince Rupert's demonic poodle. During the English Civil War, Prince Rupert was so good at his job that his enemies couldn't figure out how to beat him. So they went after his dog. Rupert had a big, fluffy white poodle named Boy who went everywhere with him. The opposition's propaganda machine went into overdrive, creating the most insane conspiracy theory ever. They claimed Boy wasn't a dog, but a shape-shifting demon who was secretly fireproof and could catch bullets in his mouth. They printed pamphlets about this evil, magical poodle. People believed it. This wasn't just a political feud. It was a feud against a dog, turning a very good boy into the most feared and legendary supervillain of the war. 4. Louis XIV versus the man who threw a better party. The King of France, Louis XIV, had an ego so large it probably needed its own postcode. His finance minister, Nicolas Fouquet, apparently missed the memo. Fouquet threw a party so unbelievably lavish and spectacular that it made the king's own royal events look like a sad, deflating birthday party. Louis was consumed with a level of jealousy so pure and so potent that he had Fouquet arrested the very next day. To make sure this would never happen again, Louis started building the Palace of Versailles, a project fueled entirely by spite. It was the architectural equivalent of a temper tantrum, a massive golden monument built just to say, "My parties are better than yours." 5. The architectural feud that shaped Rome. You've heard of rap battles, but have you heard of architecture battles? The two greatest artists of their time, Bernini and Borromini, hated each other with the passion of 1,000 suns. Their rivalry is literally set in stone all over Rome. In the city's famous Piazza Navona, Bernini built an incredible fountain. One of the giant statues on it is recoiling in what looks like pure horror, shielding its eyes. What is it looking at? The church right across the square, designed by Borromini. For centuries, a multi-ton marble statue has been throwing the most epic, stony side-eye in history, a permanent, passive-aggressive insult to its creator's nemesis. 6. The War of the Whiskers. Eleanor of Aquitaine's husband, the King of France, went off to a crusade looking like a rugged, bearded hero. He came back with a face as smooth as a peeled potato. Legend says Eleanor took one look at her clean-shaven husband and was so profoundly disappointed that it was the final nail in the coffin of their marriage. She divorced him, married the King of England, and took a huge chunk of France with her as a parting gift. This set off a chain reaction of conflicts between England and France that lasted for centuries. Let that sink in. One of the longest rivalries in European history was kicked into high gear because a queen decided her husband looked much better with a beard. 7. The Duel of the Mignons. In the French royal court, a bunch of the king's favorite pretty boys, known as the Mignons, were apparently dying of boredom. A tiny, insignificant argument broke out over a silly comment. Instead of just, talking it out, they decided the only solution was a dramatic showdown with swords. But the absurdity didn't stop there. Their friends, who were just supposed to watch, got major FOMO and decided to join in. The whole thing snowballed into a chaotic, multi-person kerfuffle over literally nothing. It was the 16th century equivalent of a ridiculous internet argument spilling out into the real world, but with way more frilly collars and pointy things. 8. The Sons of William the Conqueror. Proving that royalty doesn't automatically grant you maturity, the sons of William the Conqueror started their lifelong family feud with a prank that would make a jester blush. The two younger brothers decided it would be the peak of comedy to dump a full chamber pot on their older brother Robert's head from a balcony. Robert, who was already wound a bit tight, completely exploded with rage. This single, disgusting act of brotherly love lit the fuse for decades of backstabbing, scheming, and fighting over who got to be king. It was a golden shower of disrespect that trickled down through history. 9. The Affair of the Diamond Necklace. Imagine the world's most elaborate and disastrous prank call. A con artist, pretending to be Queen Marie Antoinette, convinced a hopelessly gullible cardinal to buy her a diamond necklace so ridiculously expensive it could probably bankrupt a small country. The cardinal, thinking he was about to become the queen's new best friend, fell for it, hook, line, and sinker. The con artist got the necklace, the cardinal got a massive bill, and Marie Antoinette, who was completely innocent and had no idea this was even happening, got her reputation utterly destroyed. The entire country believed their queen was secretly buying bling while they were broke. It was a scandal based on a lie, wrapped in a deception inside an incredibly dumb decision. 10. The War of the Stray Dog. In 1925, the border between Greece and Bulgaria was a pretty tense place. All it needed was a tiny spark to cause an explosion. That spark turned out to have 4 legs and a wagging tail. A Greek soldier's dog decided to chase a squirrel, or maybe just go on an adventure, and ran across the border. The soldier, doing what any dog owner would do, ran after it. A Bulgarian sentry saw the soldier running, and, in a moment of catastrophic overreaction, the incident escalated. This tiny event, this literal dog ran away from home story, was used as the official excuse for Greece to launch a full-scale invasion of Bulgaria. Generals had to plan troop movements because one dog couldn't resist chasing something. 11. Henry II versus the Devil's Brood. King Henry II of England was one of the most powerful rulers in Europe, but his biggest problem wasn't foreign enemies. It was his own family. He and his wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, had a bunch of sons who seemed to have one main hobby: rebelling against their dad. And Eleanor, far from being a peaceful mom, was basically their rebellion coach, constantly whispering, "You'd make a much better king than your father." The result was decades of the world's most chaotic family drama, a non-stop cycle of sons declaring war on their dad, losing, getting forgiven, and then doing it all over again a year later. It was less a royal court and more a medieval soap opera fueled by pure dysfunction. 12. Pope Urban VI, the boss from hell. In 1378, the College of Cardinals got together and elected a new pope, a guy named Urban VI. They thought they were getting a respectable reformer. Instead, they got a boss so arrogant, so angry, and so generally unpleasant that they almost immediately regretted their decision. He would insult them, yell at them, and basically act like the worst manager you've ever had. So, the Cardinals did something unprecedented. They all got together, fled the city, and declared they had made a terrible mistake. They announced the election was invalid because they were under pressure, and then they just elected a different pope. This act of spectacular buyer's remorse kicked off a 40-year schism, where the world had two popes, both claiming the other was a fake. 13. The sister feud of Bloody Mary versus Elizabeth I. Sibling rivalry is one thing, but Queen Mary I took it to a whole new level with her half-sister, Elizabeth. Mary, a devout Catholic, was deeply suspicious of the popular Protestant Elizabeth. Convinced her sister was plotting against her, Mary didn't just ground her or give her the silent treatment. She had Elizabeth arrested and locked up in the infamous Tower of London. This was the ultimate act of paranoid older sibling energy, throwing the future Queen of England into the country's most terrifying prison on the flimsiest of evidence. Elizabeth spent her days there writing letters and probably wondering if every footstep she heard was the executioner coming to settle this family squabble for good. 14. Brunhilda versus Fredegund, the Merovingian bloodbath. Forget your modern celebrity feuds. The rivalry between two Frankish queens, Brunhilda and Fredegund, was a masterclass in pure, concentrated, 60-year-long hatred. This wasn't a political disagreement. This was a deeply personal, multi-generational war of backstabbing, betrayals, and general awfulness that tore the kingdom apart. It all started over a murdered sister and spiraled into a decades-long vendetta where these two queens dedicated their entire lives to making each other miserable. They out-schemed, out-plotted, and outlasted husbands, sons, and grandsons, all while keeping their legendary grudge burning white-hot. It was the original Real Housewives, but with more crowns and way more chaos. 15. Caracalla and Geta's co-working nightmare. When the Roman emperor died, he left the empire to his two sons, Caracalla and Geta, hoping they would rule together in harmony. This was a terrible idea. The brothers hated each other so much they couldn't even stand to be in the same room. Their solution? They literally built a wall down the middle of the imperial palace to create separate apartments. This is not a metaphor. They bricked up connecting doors to avoid seeing each other. Imagine trying to run the largest empire on Earth when you and your coworker refuse to make eye contact. It was the most powerful and petty roommate dispute in history, a co-presidency doomed from the start by two brothers who couldn't even agree on who got which side of the palace. 16. The Gonzaga's insult in fresco. Duke Ludovico Gonzaga of Mantua wanted to show off his power, but he also wanted to be incredibly petty. So he hired a master painter to create a stunning fresco in his castle. The painting depicted the Duke and his family looking majestic and important. But hidden in the background, he had the artist paint in his political rivals. And he didn't have them painted as equals. Oh no. He had them depicted with goofy, stupid, and deeply unflattering expressions on their faces. It was the Renaissance equivalent of creating a meme of your enemies and then having it permanently painted onto your wall by a genius. For centuries, his rivals have been immortalized in a priceless work of art, looking like complete and utter fools. 17. Catherine the Great and her son's posthumous revenge. Catherine the Great was an absolute powerhouse of a ruler, but she had one major blind spot: her son, Paul. She thought he was a goofy, incompetent weirdo and spent her entire reign keeping him as far away from power as humanly possible. When Catherine finally died, Paul became emperor, and he was ready for some serious payback. He launched a campaign of pure, unadulterated spite against his dead mother's memory. He started systematically undoing her proudest reforms just because he could. But his masterpiece of pettiness was digging up the body of his long-dead father, Peter III, whom Catherine had overthrown, and forcing a massive, elaborate state reburial so Peter could be interred right next to the woman who despised him. It was the ultimate "I'm telling Dad" move, performed on a national scale. 18. The Queen, the Doctor, and the Coup. In 18th century Denmark, King Christian VII was, to put it mildly, not well. His doctor, a charismatic German named Johann Friedrich Struensee, stepped in to help. He helped so much, in fact, that he ended up becoming the Queen's lover and the secret ruler of the entire country. For a brief, glorious period, the doctor and the queen were running Denmark, passing radical reforms while the actual king was off in a corner, probably talking to a chair. The Danish nobility was absolutely furious. They weren't just mad about the politics, they were incandescent with rage that this upstart doctor was calling the shots. So they staged a coup, not just to regain power, but to satisfy the world's most epic case of professional jealousy. 19. Henry II versus Thomas Becket, the worst fallout. Between best friends. Henry II of England and Thomas Becket were the original bromance. They were inseparable best buddies who partied together and basically ran the country as a team. So Henry thought, I'll make my best friend the Archbishop of Canterbury, the most powerful religious job in England. What could possibly go wrong? Everything could go wrong. The moment Becket got the job, he became intensely religious and suddenly decided his loyalty was to God, not the king. Their friendship imploded spectacularly, turning into a bitter, decade-long feud over power. It all ended when Henry, in a moment of frustration, yelled something like, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" A phrase that his knights took a little too literally. 20. The Gloucester-Beaufort feud. Young King Henry VI of England was basically a kid on the throne, so the country was run by his relatives. Unfortunately, his two most powerful advisors, his uncle Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, and his great-uncle Cardinal Beaufort, hated each other with the fire of 1,000 suns. Their personal animosity was so intense it paralyzed the entire government. They would argue in meetings, scheme behind each other's backs, and their rivalry even spilled out onto the streets of London, with their private armies having actual standoffs. While these two powerful men were busy having a glorified staring contest, the country was falling apart, sliding directly into the massive civil war known as the Wars of the Roses. It was a national crisis fueled entirely by a family squabble. 21. The Medici versus the Pazzi conspiracy. In Renaissance Florence, the Medici family were the undisputed kings of banking and politics. Their biggest rivals, the Pazzi family, were consumed with a level of jealousy so deep they decided the only solution was to get rid of the Medicis for good. But they didn't just want to win, they wanted to make a statement. So they planned their attack for the most sacred and public place imaginable, the middle of Sunday Mass in Florence's main cathedral. As the priest raised the communion host, the Pazzi assassins jumped the Medici brothers with daggers. It was an act of such shocking, blasphemous audacity that it backfired completely, turning the entire city against them and cementing the Medici's power forever. 22. Dowager Empress Cixi and the Pearl Concubine. The ruler of China, Dowager Empress Cixi, was a master of political maneuvering and holding a grudge. Her nephew, the emperor, had a favorite concubine, a bright and lovely young woman known as the Pearl Concubine. Cixi couldn't stand her. Was it because she was a political threat? A spy? Nope. It was mostly because the emperor actually listened to her and liked her more than he liked his powerful, controlling aunt. During the Boxer Rebellion, as the court was fleeing the Forbidden City, Cixi saw her chance to settle this petty score. She ordered her eunuchs to grab the Pearl Concubine and, in an act of supreme and horrifying spite, had her thrown down a well. 23. King Farouk, the royal thief. King Farouk of Egypt was a man of many quirks, one of which was that he was a kleptomaniac. He just couldn't resist stealing small, shiny things, even though he was a king who could afford literally anything. During World War II, he managed to steal a prized pocket watch right from the waistcoat of the notoriously grumpy British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill. Years later, a different British ambassador, who knew all about Farouk's sticky fingers and general incompetence, had the perfect excuse to flex his power. He surrounded the king's palace with tanks and forced him to change his government, an international power play that probably felt just a little bit sweeter knowing he was dealing with the guy who nicked Churchill's watch. 24. Justinian II, the emperor who came back for noses. Byzantine emperor. Justinian II was not a popular guy. His people got so fed up with him that they overthrew him. But to make sure he could never be emperor again, Since emperors had to be physically perfect, they did something especially cruel. They cut off his nose and exiled him. They assumed that would be the end of it. They were wrong. Justinian, now known as the Slit-Nosed, was consumed by a desire for revenge. He didn't just sit in exile feeling sorry for himself. He raised an army, snuck back into Constantinople through a water pipe, and retook his throne. His first order of business? A brutal, citywide revenge tour against every single person who had wronged him, proving that you should never, ever underestimate a man with a grudge and a missing nose. 25. The Poisoned Pea, Soup of Sweden. The sons of Swedish King Gustav Vasa turned sibling rivalry into a national sport. Two of them, Eric and Johann, were locked in a bitter feud for the throne. First, Eric became king and imprisoned Johann. Then, Johann got out, overthrew Eric, and imprisoned him instead. It was a royal game of musical thrones. But Johann was constantly paranoid that Eric would somehow make a comeback. According to a very persistent legend, Johann finally decided to solve his brother problem for good. He ordered Eric to be poisoned. The chosen method? Not a sneaky drop in his wine, but supposedly a lethal dose of arsenic stirred into a hearty bowl of pea soup. It's the most mundane, comfort food assassination plot in all of history. 26. Roxolana versus Mustafa, the Ottoman succession soap opera. In the court of the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, the drama was better than any show on television. Suleiman's favorite wife, the brilliant and cunning Roxolana, was determined that one of her sons would inherit the throne, not the Sultan's talented and popular firstborn son, Mustafa. So Roxolana launched a masterclass in office politics and subtle manipulation. She spent years whispering in Suleiman's ear, forging letters, and spinning a web of rumors that made the loyal Mustafa look like a traitor who was plotting a coup. She played the game so well that Suleiman, one of the most powerful men in the world, was completely convinced and tragically ordered the execution of his own innocent son, all based on the spectacular grudge of his wife. 27. King Ludwig II versus his own government. King Ludwig II of Bavaria wasn't interested in boring things like politics or economics. He had a much more important mission, building the most ridiculously over-the-top, fairy tale-inspired castles imaginable. He poured the entire royal treasury, and then some, into constructing fantasy worlds of shimmering grottos and swan-themed thrones. His government ministers tried to reason with him, begging him to stop spending all their money on architectural daydreams. Ludwig's response was to basically stick his fingers in his ears and commission another castle. Finally, his exasperated government had enough. They staged a coup by declaring him insane, effectively firing their king for being the world's most extravagant and irresponsible interior decorator. 28. The Paper Crown of Richard of York. During the Wars of the Roses, Richard, Duke of York, was captured in battle by the forces of his rival, Queen Margaret of Anjou. To simply execute him wasn't enough. They wanted to humiliate him first. They shoved a flimsy paper crown on his head, mocking his claim to the throne, before finishing the job. This single act of theatrical insult was a catastrophic mistake. It turned a political conflict into a deeply personal, blood-soaked vendetta. Richard's son, Edward, was now not just fighting for a throne, he was fighting to avenge his father's ultimate humiliation. That flimsy paper crown became a symbol that fueled some of the most brutal and bitter fighting of the entire war. 29. Edward II and Piers Gaveston's unpopular friendship. King Edward II of England had a best friend named Piers Gaveston, and the other English barons absolutely could not stand him. Gaveston was arrogant, witty, and he loved giving the stuffy, powerful nobles insulting nicknames like calling the Earl of Warwick the Black Dog of Arden. You can imagine how well that went down. The barons' hatred for Gaveston became a national obsession. They weren't just annoyed, they were consumed by a collective fury against this one guy. They forced the king to exile him, not once, but twice. When he came back again, they took matters into their own hands, kidnapped him, and settled the score, an act that plunged the entire kingdom into a civil war, all because they couldn't handle being the butt of a few jokes. 30. Isabella versus Juana la Beltraneja, the War of the Questionable Father. The war for the crown of Castile was a full-blown succession crisis, but it was fueled by one of the most humiliating rumors in royal history. The reigning king had a daughter named Juana, but a nasty rumor spread like wildfire, claiming she wasn't the king's daughter at all. Instead, the gossip mongers insisted her real father was the king's dashing favorite courtier, Beltrán de la Cueva. She was relentlessly mocked with the nickname La Beltraneja. Her rival, Isabella, yes, that Isabella of Columbus fame, used this rumor as her primary weapon. The entire war was framed around this deeply personal and insulting question of Juana's parentage, turning a political struggle into a nationwide soap opera about who was sleeping with whom. 31. Queen Victoria's first act of freedom. For the first 18 years of her life, the future Queen Victoria was suffocated by her mother's hyper-controlling Kensington system. She was never allowed to be alone, never allowed to walk downstairs without someone holding her hand, and forced to sleep in her mother's bedroom every single night. The moment she was told she was now Queen of the United Kingdom, her very first command wasn't about politics or treaties. It was an order to have her bed moved out of her mother's room and into its own private space. This small, simple act was a declaration of war. It was the first shot fired in her own personal, lifelong battle for independence against the woman who had controlled her every move. 32. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots' dog. The long and bitter feud between Mary, Queen of Scots, and her cousin Queen Elizabeth I ended on the executioner's block. It was a grim, tragic affair, but the final, heartbreaking detail of the rivalry happened right after the axe fell. Hidden beneath Mary's voluminous skirts for the entire ordeal was her tiny Skye Terrier. As the executioners went to move the body, the little dog, soaked in his owner's blood, suddenly darted out, whimpering and refusing to leave her side. It was a moment so shocking and so sad that it horrified even the hardened officials present, a final, tragic testament to the loyalty that had been so absent during Mary's tumultuous life. 33. Ivan the Terrible's pen pal from hell. When you're known as Ivan the Terrible, you're probably not great at handling criticism. Prince Kurbsky, one of Ivan's closest friends and top generals, got fed up with the Tsar's increasingly erratic behavior and defected to the enemy in Lithuania. Ivan was absolutely livid, but instead of just declaring Kurbsky a traitor, Ivan initiated one of history's most bizarre and long-distance feuds. For years, the two men exchanged a series of scathing letters, becoming the world's angriest pen pals. They traded epic, rambling insults, theological accusations, and generally questioned each other's entire existence. It was a full-blown war of words, a masterclass in 16th century trolling between a furious Tsar and the one friend who got away. 34. The accidental death of William Rufus. King William II of England, known as William Rufus, was out for a pleasant day of hunting with his brother Henry and a group of nobles. Suddenly, an arrow flew through the forest and struck the king dead. Oops. As his brother lay dying, Henry didn't rush to his side or call for help. No, he immediately spurred his horse and galloped at top speed in the opposite direction, straight to the royal treasury. He seized control of the kingdom's finances before anyone even knew the king was dead, basically claiming the throne via the dibs system. The official story was that it was a tragic hunting accident, but Henry's lightning-fast power grab has made it the most suspicious accident in English history. 35. King Charles VI and the Masquerade Ball of Death. King Charles VI of France was known for his fragile mental state. So, allowing him to participate in a party where he and 5 of his friends dressed up as wild men of the forest, in flammable costumes made of linen and pitch-soaked fur was probably not a great idea. It was supposed to be a hilarious surprise for the court. The plan went horribly wrong when the king's brother, who was late to the party, showed up drunk and carrying a flaming torch. He stumbled into one of the furry dancers, who immediately burst into a human inferno, setting off a chain reaction. It was a night of pure, unmitigated chaos and horror. all because a bunch of nobles thought a dangerously flammable prank would be a real knee-slapper. 36. The bloodbath at Roskilde. After a long civil war, the three rival claimants to the Danish throne decided to get together for a peace banquet to finally sort things out. One of them, a guy named Sweyn, had a very different idea of what sorting things out meant. In the middle of the feast, he gave a signal to his men. They promptly locked the doors to the hall and drew their swords. The supposed peace banquet instantly turned into a bloody free-for-all as Sweyn tried to eliminate his two rivals right then and there. It was the most treacherous dinner party imaginable, a brutal and shocking betrayal that proved that sometimes the most dangerous place to be is at the negotiating table, especially if your rival is in charge of the seating chart. 37. The humiliation of Empress Matilda. During the English Civil War known as the Anarchy, Empress Matilda, one of the main contenders for the throne, found herself trapped and besieged in Oxford Castle during a bitter winter. Her rival's army was camped outside, waiting for her to surrender. Facing the ultimate humiliation of capture, Matilda concocted a desperate and incredibly bold escape plan. One night, dressed entirely in white to camouflage herself against the snow, she and a few knights were lowered from the castle walls. They then crept through the enemy camp, crossed the frozen River Thames on foot, and walked for miles through the snow to safety. It was a stunningly cinematic escape, a queen forced into a desperate act of stealth to avoid becoming a trophy in her family's feud. 38. The Battle of the Herrings. During the 100 Years' War, the French army was trying to besiege the English-held city of Orléans. An English supply convoy approached, carrying not weapons or gold, but barrels of salted herrings to feed their soldiers for Lent. The French, seeing what looked like an easy target, launched a massive attack on the fish delivery. What followed was one of the most embarrassing defeats in French military history. The English used their wagons to form a makeshift fortress and absolutely demolished the much larger French force. The French not only failed to capture the city, but were publicly humiliated in a battle that would forever be known by the most ridiculous name possible: the Battle of the Herrings. 39. The Affair of the Poisons. The court of the Sun King Louis XIV was a glamorous place, but beneath the surface, the competition for royal favor was literally cutthroat. A number of high-ranking aristocratic ladies, desperate to get rid of their rivals at court or their inconvenient husbands, turned to a dark network of fortune-tellers and alchemists who also happened to sell inheritance powders, a fancy name for poison. The scandal exploded when authorities realized that half the nobility seemed to be secretly trying to poison the other half. It was a massive, paranoid witch hunt that exposed the rotten, jealous core of the world's most sophisticated court, where a bitter feud could be settled with a single tainted cup of wine. 40. King Charles II of Spain and the Bewitched Feuds. King Charles II of Spain was the product of so much royal inbreeding that he was plagued by a host of terrible health problems his entire life. The nobles and politicians at court, instead of acknowledging the obvious genetic issues, came up with a much more exciting explanation. The king was bewitched. This became the ultimate political weapon. Every time something went wrong with the king's health, rival factions at court would immediately start accusing each other of hiring sorcerers and casting evil spells. The entire Spanish government was bogged down in a permanent state of supernatural feuding and exorcism attempts, all because nobody wanted to admit the real problem was the family tree. 41. The War of the Bucket of Garcia Munoz. Proving that humanity is doomed to repeat its dumbest mistakes, Italy wasn't the only place to have a war over a bucket. In 15th century Spain, a local feud between two noble families spiraled out of control over the rights to, you guessed it, a bucket and its associated water well. This petty local squabble escalated into a real armed conflict. Tragically, the war became fatal for one of Spain's greatest poets, Jorge Manrique, who was killed during one of the skirmishes. He died fighting not for a grand cause or for his country's honor, but in a pointless little war that history only remembers because it was fought over a bucket. 42. The Lost Horse Race of Xerxes. According to the Greek historian Herodotus, one of the personal reasons for the massive Persian invasion of Greece had its roots in a horse race. The Persian king Xerxes, a man not known for his humility, was furious when his prize horse lost a race to a Greek horse. He saw it not just as a sporting defeat, but as a personal insult and a terrible omen. This relatively minor event, this single lost bet, supposedly festered in his mind, adding a personal, petty spark to his already grand ambitions of conquest. It suggests that one of the most famous wars of the ancient world was at least partially fueled by the bruised ego of a king who just couldn't stand to lose. 43. The sister feud of Bloody Mary versus Elizabeth I. Sibling rivalry is one thing, but Queen Mary I took it to a whole new level with her half-sister, Elizabeth. Mary, a devout Catholic, was deeply suspicious of the popular Protestant Elizabeth. Convinced her sister was plotting against her, Mary didn't just ground her or give her the silent treatment. She had Elizabeth arrested and locked up in the infamous Tower of London. This was the ultimate act of paranoid older sibling energy, throwing the future Queen of England into the country's most terrifying prison on the flimsiest of evidence. Elizabeth spent her days there writing letters and probably wondering if every footstep she heard was the executioner coming to settle this family squabble for good. 44. Henry II versus the Devil's Brood. King Henry II of England was one of the most powerful rulers in Europe, but his biggest problem wasn't foreign enemies, it was his own family. He and his wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, had a bunch of sons who seemed to have one main hobby, rebelling against their dad. And Eleanor, far from being a peaceful mom, was basically their rebellion coach, constantly whispering, "You know, you'd make a much better king than your father." The result was decades of the world's most chaotic family drama, a non-stop cycle of sons declaring war on their dad, losing, getting forgiven, and then doing it all over again a year later. It was less a royal court and more a medieval soap opera fueled by pure dysfunction. So, 44 proofs that history was often written by pettiness, not wisdom. This begs an uncomfortable question. Is history just a polite word for a highlight reel of powerful men's tantrums? I challenge you to argue in the comments that the single most destructive force in human history isn't a powerful man who was simply told no. While you settle that debate, support this channel's descent into absurdity with a like and subscribe.